actually the Mossad official emblem. It's actually a verse in the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, Proverbs 11:14. And the verse says, Be'ein tachbulot yipol am. Without trickery, a nation will fall. Uvarov utshuot barov yoetz, and salvation is found with an abundance of counsel. So a very appropriate verse for the Mossad, tachbulot, trickery, yoetz, counseling, and intelligence. And that's a verse in Proverbs. Now, you might ask, kosher spy, what's the Mossad got to do with that? So, and the answer is that, the Mossad mostly recruits from people in the combat units of the IDF, usually very often tier 1 special forces units. Now, in the IDF, approximately 10% of the soldiers in the IDF are in combat units. It's a surprising percentage, but combat units, most people are not in combat. Most people are in support. They're about 10%. Of that, religious soldiers form a significant percentage. And certainly in officer and command positions, there is a fairly religious soldiers are overrepresented in command positions in combat. And consequently, you'd expect that there would be a significant amount of religious soldiers or Mossad agents. And in fact, we don't know a lot about the Mossad because it is obviously secret. But according to reports in Israeli newspapers, this is from Ma'ariv, famous Israeli newspaper, this is in 2014, the Mossad actually appointed their own rabbi. As you probably know, the Israeli army has rabbis. I was a rabbi in the Israeli army, but the Israeli army has rabbis, and there are many, not many, but there are people with high security clearance in the Israeli army who are rabbis. For example, the current chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, is actually a colonel in the intelligence unit reserves. He's a reserve intelligence colonel. And there are plenty of rabbis and people with advanced degrees in Talmudic law, etc., who have also been in combat and have a good security clearance. So according to the article in Ma'ariv, they said, obviously, the identity of the chaplain is classified. Ma'ariv was allowed to publish that he's a former IDF intelligence and military rabbinate officer. He was appointed to his current position while Brigadier General Avichai Ronsky served as the IDF chief rabbi. Now, the fact that the Mossad has its own rabbi, we know in the army, there is actually a group of army chaplains whose job it is to research positions of Jewish law in areas of combat morality and areas of combat ethics, areas of the functioning of an army, etc. And there's actually a group of them in Tel Aviv who actually spend most of their day researching these questions. Obviously, a lot of the questions are going to require that the person asked of them have security clearance. The fact that the Mossad appointed its own rabbi would seem to indicate that there was enough of a need of religious agents in the Mossad to require their own rabbi with sufficient security clearance. This particular rabbi sometimes asked his questions to a rabbi called Rav Asher Weiss. Rav Asher Weiss is a very famous halachic decizer who is actually born in the United States but lives in Israel. And he is one of the great poskim of our generation. And yes, he is often consulted by this rabbi. So let me begin first with the fact that the Mossad is an unusual, very unusual intelligence agency, not because it is so effective, which it is very effective, but because of the type of tasks that it has engaged in, which are not the typical tasks of intelligence agencies. Intelligence agencies' jobs usually are to gather intelligence on enemies and often on friends, so that you can be prepared sufficiently to defend yourself, and you can attack your enemies, etc. The Mossad is unusual in that it has engaged in many, many operations that are not at all normal operations for intelligence units. I'll give you some examples of that. First of all, immediately following the establishment of the state in 1948, it wasn't actually called Mossad at that time, but there were units who during the 1950s would hunt Nazis and would kill Nazis in Europe. There was actually I guess the ancestor of that was the Jewish Brigade. That was a section of the British Army called the Jewish Brigade that towards the end of the war was able to fight against the Nazis in Europe. And the members of the Jewish Brigade would just at the end of the war were using the logistics of the British Army and their weapons to hunt down Nazis and execute them. There's a fascinating book about them because they actually changed their modus operandi. They walked into a church where the priest was a former Nazi who was disguised as a priest. And as they were about to execute him, a little girl in the church ran over to them, seeing Hebrew on their uniform, Star of David. And she said, "Are you here to take me home to Israel?" And they said, "No, we're here to kill this guy." And but it was that incident that actually changed their operational goal, and they switched from assassinating Nazis to getting Jewish children in Europe to Israel. And that was one of the early clandestine operations of the Haganah, which was the predecessor of the IDF, was actually smuggling Jews out of Europe into Israel. And the Mossad continued to do that throughout Israeli history. We know the Ethiopian Jew, I don't know if you've seen the movie, it's absolutely a lousy movie, but the Red Sea Diving Resort, which is a dramatization of an actual story in which the Mossad had a diving resort, which was run by Mossad agents, that was designed to get Jews out of Ethiopia via Sudan through the Red Sea into Israel. And they succeeded in spiriting thousands of Jews out of Ethiopia. The Mossad was also responsible for getting Jews out of Morocco at a time when the Moroccan government initially was not allowing Aliyah to Israel, Syrian Jews, etc. So that was one job of the Mossad that has been, and they've been doing that through the entire history of the state of Israel, which is bringing people to it. That's not the normal job that a intelligence agency performs. So that's one thing that they have done. Secondly, they, aside and assassinating Nazis, I do know someone who was involved he was not a Mossad agent, but he was involved in training the Mossad agents. And yes, he used to get occasional postcards, been hunting successfully. So we'll discuss that. Another aspect of what they did, for instance, the very famous capture of Adolf Eichmann and bringing him to trial in Israel. Adolf Eichmann, known as the architect of the Holocaust, who was hiding under an assumed name in Argentina, probably with the knowledge of the Argentinian government, and the Mossad tracked him down, sent a unit over there. I had the privilege of meeting Peter Malkin, who was one of the Mossad agents responsible for capturing Eichmann. He was actually the guy who grabbed him in the street and threw him into the car. Peter Malkin was a retired Mossad. He was in his 70s when I met him. He was an artist, and he had been chosen for two reasons. A, he was an expert in martial arts, and B, he was an expert in disguise, and they had to disguise Eichmann to get him out of Argentina. Wonderful, wonderful man, passed away a number of years ago. So the capture of Adolf Eichmann, another example of what the Mossad did, which is very unusual, was smuggling Jewish artifacts into Israel from other countries. For example, one of the oldest and most accurate copies of the Bible was written in Tiberias in the 8th century, and eventually ended up in Jerusalem, then afterwards in Cairo, and then afterwards in Aleppo in Syria, where it was kept in the great synagogue by the Jews of Aleppo from about the 13th century until 1948. 1948, there were riots against the Jews in Syria and in most Arab countries, and the synagogue was burnt down, and the Syrian Jews were able to save most of the what was called the Aleppo Codex, that particular Bible, and they hid it in Syria until the 1950s. The president of Israel at the time, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, was a historian, and he tasked the Mossad with getting that Aleppo Codex, that Bible, out of Syria into Israel, which they succeeded in doing in the mid-50s, and brought it to mid-50s or late 50s, I think, and they brought it to Israel via Turkey. So again, a little bit unusual, but that is something which the Mossad did. Another thing that they did, and I was peripherally involved, was teaching Russian Jews in Russia during the Soviet Union, when it was under the rule of the communists. It was illegal to teach Judaism, and there were all types of restrictions on Jews who'd made requests to go to Israel. These people were called refuseniks. The Mossad was involved in financing and organizing people to go to the Soviet Union and teach Judaism to the Jews there. My wife and I were there for 10 days teaching in Moscow. It was illegal. We made contact with the Israelis who were there, transferred, actually the refuseniks asked for Hebrew translations of the Talmud, which we brought in for them. We got them from the trade fair, switched them with Reform prayer books, which the refuseniks did not want, but which were brought in by some Americans. So the Israelis would enter and leave with the same amount of books, which were counted by the Russians. So the Mossad was involved in financing and helping in a lot of those operations. Again, very unusual to have a intelligence unit educating people in Judaism in a foreign country. But that's what they were doing. The most recent atypical intelligence operation, and obviously the stuff they're doing in Iran is typical intelligence stuff. But the atypical stuff is they were able to get COVID testing kits to Israel in the early days. The Mossad somehow, I don't know where they got them from, but they got thousands and thousands of COVID test kits, which they brought into Israel. So anyway, those are some of the unusual aspects of the Mossad. And obviously, in terms of their successes throughout the past, whether it was the assassination of terrorists, etc., are fairly well known. So a few halachic issues. First of all, where do we find the first spies? Moses and the Jews send spies to the land of Israel. The Jews are in what we call today Jordan, on the east bank of the Jordan River, and he sends spies into Israel. We know that it didn't go well, but interestingly, Nachmanides says there was no sin in sending spies at all. He says, on the contrary, he says, the Torah does not allow us to rely on miracles. He says it is normal for any invading army, anyone involved in any type of warfare, to send spies, to have intelligence, etc. He says we see that Moses did that later on. Joshua did the same thing. Joshua sent spies to Jericho. There was nothing wrong with that. And on the contrary, it was the appropriate thing to do. We find later on, King David sent some spies to check out the positions of the Philistines to see how nervous they were, etc. So the sending of spies and having some type of intelligence service was not something that is unusual, and is certainly something which Judaism is certainly not against. We believe in what we call hishtadlut. Hishtadlut means efforts, human efforts. God does not want us to rely on miracles, even though he frequently does them for us, but he does not want us to rely on them. And consequently, Jewish law certainly is in favor of having the best military training we can have. In fact, Maimonides, in not a very well-known letter, but it's a letter he wrote to rabbis in Montpellier in France, Provence, more correctly. And he wrote to the rabbis in Montpellier, and he said to them that I think, he said, one of the reasons that the temple was destroyed is that there were many Jews at the time who were reading all types of books on superstitious things like astrology, etc., and they thought that would help them more than military preparations. Had they engaged in more military preparations and greater efforts in defending themselves, who knows, maybe they could have defended themselves successfully. Just pretty surprising thing for Maimonides to say, but it actually does fit in with what we are talking about here. So the first halachic question we have to ask ourselves is, Jewish legal question is, what is the justification for assassination of Nazis? The war is over. They do not present a danger. Adolf Eichmann, although two of his sons were involved in neo-Nazi terrorist cells in Argentina, so there's a good argument to kill his sons, but Eichmann himself no longer posed a danger to the Jewish people. Now, as we know, the Mossad had a campaign of letter bombs and assassinations aimed at Nazi scientists who had been recruited by Egypt and Syria to build weapons for them, missiles and poison gas. That's totally legitimate self-defense, killing and terrorizing those people to prevent them from working on these weapons to kill Jews in Israel. That's certainly obviously legitimate self-defense. But what about someone who is a retired US auto worker like Ivan Demanyuk, who was on trial in Israel? I remember the trial very well. So it no longer poses a danger. Is vengeance something which is legitimate from a Jewish perspective? So first of all, it could be argued that even vengeance is also self-defense, meaning if a terrorist who is contemplating attacks against Israel or the Jews, if a neo-Nazi contemplating attacks, if he knows that the arm of Israel reached out and killed someone in Argentina or in Norway or in Italy who did a terrorist attack or an act of genocide against Jews 20 years earlier, and he is now dead, they're going to think twice about doing an act of terrorism. They're going to think twice about attacking Israel or the Jews. So I think a legitimate argument could be made that that assassinating terrorists or Nazis who have done things in the past is a legitimate act of self-defense, number one. Number two, we also know that tactically speaking, if various leaders of terrorist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., European Union, if any of these people, whatever they're planning in terms of terrorist attacks, if they have to always be looking over their shoulder because some Israeli with a Beretta is going to double tap them in the head, then they are going to be less effective terrorist leaders, which is also legitimate self-defense. So I think there's two strong arguments for self-defense here. And a third is that people will see that you cannot get away with it. Right? That's a self-defense argument for vengeance. There's another argument for vengeance, which is that vengeance is a form of justice. Who else is bringing Eichmann to justice? He is living in Argentina under the protection of the Argentinian government, which only not too long ago reinstated El Al flights to Argentina because they were upset for the past 30 years because Israel used El Al to get Eichmann out of Argentina. So anyway, but if they're harboring a guy like that, is Germany bringing him to justice? No. Are the Russians bringing him to justice? No. That means who is going to bring this person to justice if not for the state of Israel? So in my opinion, aside from the self-defense aspects of assassinating terrorists and assassinating Nazis, there is another aspect. There's another aspect, which is, I think, the justice, because no one else is doing it. And if no one else is doing it, then it falls upon the state of Israel to do it. Interestingly, in Eichmann's defense, when Eichmann, during his trial, one of his, the Nuremberg trials are actually a great example of not enough being brought to justice. Only 10 Nazis were sentenced to hanging in the Nuremberg trials. Out of how many? How many people were responsible? What, do you think 10 Nazis killed millions of people? There's no way. Nuremberg trials are an example of where there was not enough justice. Anyway, but so it's the seeking of justice as well as vengeance. And it's interesting, one of our commentaries, the Sefer Achinuch, points out that he says ultimately, he says the human desire for revenge is at its source a desire for the righting of wrongs. Sometimes it's misused, very often it's misused, but not always. In fact, the Hebrew word vengeance, nekama, comes from the word lahakim, to set up, to cause to stand. He says, when the scales are tipped, innocent people have been murdered, evil people are prospering, nekama, that type of vengeance causes the evil people to fall and their victims to stand. And in that sense, it's justified. So that would be one issue that has come up. Another issue that has come up is a Mossad agent who is under deep cover in another country. And I've met actually, I met a Mossad agent who, Ethiopian actually, he worked for the Mossad in Ethiopia, getting Jews out of Ethiopia. He worked with the Mossad. And so let's say you've got a Jew who's working, usually most of the Mossad agents are Jewish. The two most famous Mossad agents, by the way, I really should mention them. The most famous is Eli Cohen, who was, and here's the question, Eli Cohen was a Jew, a Middle Eastern Jew, who infiltrated the Syrian community in Argentina and then left Argentina to go to Syria, where he became a businessman in Syria and became friendly with with all the top government officials of Syria. There were even some talks in the Ba'ath party of electing him to yes, there is a movie with Sacha Baron Cohen. It's actually quite good about Lee Cohen. And he was even in a position to possibly elected to a position in the government for the Ba'ath party. He was friends with all the top military people, etc. He got tours of the fortifications in the Golan Heights, etc. Now, here's the issue. So obviously living in Syria, disguised as a Syrian Muslim, obviously he cannot be seen to be doing anything Jewish. Taking things like tefillin with him, suicidal. If he's found with them, it's over. Right? Obviously, cannot eat kosher. He has to eat anything anyone else is eating. Right? Yom Kippur, Shabbat. Literally, he cannot virtually any mitzvah in the Torah he can't keep. I mean, so many of the mitzvot. He is basically living a life in which he is transgressing right and left serious transgressions of Jewish law. So the first point we have to make is, in a pikuach nefesh situation, meaning if it's a life and death situation, and a spy like Eli Cohen spying on Syria, one of the main enemies of the state of Israel, he is involved in life-saving operations. Involvement in life-saving operations means you're allowed to do things like that. In fact, the Torah even allows, and Maimonides says this explicitly, the Torah even allows a soldier in battle, even if they're not starving, they're just hungry, they can eat whatever non-kosher food is available on the battlefield. If they take over a city and there's non-kosher food there, you can eat it. Absolutely permitted. In fact, I have three sons who are in the Israeli army. One was in field intelligence, one is in Givati, one in paratroopers. And they know that I've mentioned this before. They actually asked me, so cool. So if we come across a good shawarma place in Lebanon, is that okay? Yeah. So the truth is, it is okay. But certainly an agent who is in a foreign country where he has to conceal his true identity is certainly allowed to eat non-kosher and not keep Shabbat and so on and so forth. Although I should point out that Rav Aaron, there was a Rabbi Avraham Wallfish, who is a teacher at a yeshiva in Israel called Har Etzion. It's a Hesder yeshiva. That's a yeshiva where the students spend half their time in the army, half in the yeshiva. So there's a lot of them are in elite units. So one of the students was going to be recruited. The Mossad wanted him to be an agent. He was a Sephardi. He spoke fluent Arabic, and they wanted to recruit him as an agent. And he asked Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, head of the yeshiva, if it was appropriate to do this. So Rav Aaron Lichtenstein had a very interesting idea. He said this, look, we know it's wrong for an observant soldier to have a non-observant soldier do his duty on Shabbat. Like, I keep Shabbat, but if they give me guard duty on Shabbat, one of my kids, he was in the radio room for Rosh Hashanah. He spent Rosh Hashanah in the radio room of his unit because that was his job at the time. He had to be in the radio room. He got out to hear shofar, and the rest of the time he's in the radio room. So it would be wrong for him to switch with a non-observant soldier. That would be wrong, because the non-observant soldier is also obligated to keep Shabbat. But Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein said that's true in a momentary situation. But he said, look, he says, putting yourself in a situation where long-term you are living and not observing any of the mitzvot, if you are observant, that's really rough. That's very, very painful. If there's another person who is not observant and is as qualified as you, then it will be less painful for him to do that, or her, than you. And that's what he suggested to his student. However, if you are the most qualified, then certainly all these things would actually be permitted. One of the questions that rose is someone like a Mossad agent who is undercover in another country. So let's say we know that obviously they have furloughs. So by a circuitous route, as Eli Cohen did, he'd go from Syria to Argentina, Argentina to Brazil, Brazil to Europe, to somewhere in Europe, 2 places in Europe, then eventually to Israel to see his wife and his family. Now, should a Mossad agent, what should they do? They've been living like a non-Jew for a year. What's the first mitzvah? What should they try and do? Should they try and get out for Yom Kippur? Should they try and get out for Rosh Hashanah to hear the shofar? Should they try and get out for Purim to hear the Megillah? What's the protocol? You haven't been doing any mitzvah. I mean, if your life is about mitzvah, if you haven't been doing any mitzvah for a year, what should you do first? So this is a question that was actually asked to Reb David ben Zimra, who was a rabbi in Egypt in the 16th century. He was actually the Rais al-Yahud. He was the head of the Jewish community there, Rais al-Yahud. And he was asked this question. There was a Jew imprisoned in Egypt. And the officials in the prison said he can have a 1-day furlough. He can get out for 1 day. So apparently the rabbi was visiting at the time when he heard this, and he asked the rabbi, what should I do? Should I take the furlough today or tomorrow immediately and just do the first mitzvah that I come across? Or should I wait till Yom Kippur? Should I wait till Rosh Hashanah? What should I do? So the Radvaz, Reb David ben Zimra, a very famous responsum, he said, look, if you've got the opportunity now, we have a principle, a mitzvah that comes to your hands, don't let it rise and become chametz. Seize the moment, carpe diem, seize the moment. He says, if they give you a furlough tomorrow, you take it tomorrow and just do the first mitzvah that comes to your hands. If you have the opportunity to go to synagogue, go to put on tefillin, whatever it is, first thing. He says, because who knows? Maybe you'll take the furlough for Yom Kippur in 6 months. Who knows if you'll be alive then? Maybe they'll change their minds then. Maybe, who knows what will happen? He says, so therefore the rule would be for someone who's been in a situation where they cannot keep mitzvot for various reasons, the rule would be that they should just seize the first opportunity they can. Obviously, security protocols in mind. Obviously, he's not going to go into a synagogue somewhere outside of Israel where he could be seen, and it would be a giveaway. So that's one of the other questions come. Another question that has come up, although I think this might be more theoretical, it's not clear to me. You've probably all heard of what they call the honey trap scenario, where an intelligence agent seduces someone from a foreign intelligence unit, etc. We know that there was a nuclear physicist from Israel by the name of Mordechai Vanunu, who worked in Dimona, the nuclear reactor there, and he after he left his job and he went to England and he started giving away information about Dimona in England. So Israel, suddenly, he was in England giving out information and press interviews, etc. Israel was very upset. He suddenly turns up in Israel a week later and on trial and imprisoned. How did they get him to Israel? So the story goes, they had a Mossad agent, a woman, who was, I would imagine, attractive, who lured him onto a boat in the Thames for a date, and on the boat with several swarthy Mossad gentlemen with large shoulders who immediately took him and kidnapped him, took him to Israel. So the question is this permitted? Now, I have a feeling that democracies do not ask this of their agents. I don't know. I can't say for sure, but I have a strong feeling that I don't think Israel would ask this of their agents. But let's say they did. I don't know if she actually, in the case of Mordechai Vanunu, pretty sure at least the way the story came out in the press, she didn't have to sleep with him. She just lured him onto the boat, and where he was immediately overwhelmed by the Israeli security people. But if she did, what would be the rule? So you could probably think of a precedent for this. There is one precedent. There's actually a few precedents for this. One precedent is obviously Esther. Queen Esther, Mordechai tells her she is taken to the palace of Ahasuerus. What does she have to do? She has to sleep with, not only, she stays married to Ahasuerus. Now, what was the excuse? I'm assuming everyone here knows the story of the Scroll of Esther. If not, Rabbi Lewis, you should have your salary cut in half if they don't know the story. But, all right, so it's only 1 million now a year. It's that's, I'm sorry, but that's the way it goes. Anyway, so but the Queen Esther sleeps with Ahasuerus and stays as his wife. But she did that to save who? Well, basically the entire Jewish people. There are some who would argue, and in Ma'ariv, in the newspaper in Israel, they claim that this was actually permitted by the Mossad rabbi, although obviously this is impossible to verify, and it's lurid, so it sells newspapers. But again, Esther was apparently allowed to live with Ahasuerus, who's A, not Jewish, and B, she was, according to many opinions, married to Mordechai, and yet she was allowed to do this to save the Jewish people. So if it would be evaluated that that indeed the agent, he or she, was literally saving the lives of thousands of Jews, saving the state of Israel from nuclear weapons of Iran, then it would appear to be permitted. This is based on a responsum of Rabbi Cheskel Landau, known as the Noda Yehuda, who actually does say such a thing. He says, "Haita lahatzalat klal Yisrael mehodu v'akush." She slept with Ahasuerus to save the Jewish people from India to Ethiopia. He says, and the saving of the Jewish people certainly would permit such a thing to be done. So those are some of the issues that have been raised regarding the Mossad that have been discussed amongst authorities. And I'm sure there's a lot more to discuss, but I think our time is up. Is it? Or do I have a few more minutes?
I think that we'll stop. This is if it's a good stopping point, let's stop here.
This is a good stopping point. We just had a knock at the door from some Middle Eastern looking gentlemen. Oh, okay. All right. So anyway, fine.
Might be a good time to take care of them. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Becher.
Pleasure.
All right. Okay, everyone, we will go into our rooms, and we'll see everyone back in 15 minutes.
All right, we are back.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yes, we are. Okay,
Back in
welcome
action.
back.
Sorry, Monday.
Welcome back Monday nights, guys. So great to see everyone back. It's been like, how long has it been? It's like a month, right? At least a month, more than a month.
Yeah, I think it's more than. Yeah, Dan says too long.
Way too
I think
long.
he's right, Rabbi. Yeah, I think it's more
Agreed.
than a month, Rabbi.
Well, first thing, before we get to our trivia questions, our barbecue is going to be our first live event. I know not everyone is comfortable going to live events yet, but for those who are, this will be outside in Highland Park in an undisclosed location at my house. And it's going to be Sunday, May 2nd. So this is going to be our first live event. This is the first one in over a year, and I can't wait to see live faces. So that's something I'm really looking forward to.
Hey, we made it very, kind of, almost.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Okay, Ashley, without any further ado, why don't you give us some questions?
Okay, so reminder to get your chat box open